Hello, I'm Cordelia Anderson, and I'm here for the Joshua Center to talk about the history of child sexual abuse prevention and efforts. Now, when I'm talking about history, the reality is that's my version of history, informed by my over 42 years of experience, but it depends on, you could get a different history from an individual program, a different history from somebody coming from a child welfare or a law enforcement or an academic or a research perspective. There definitely is a difference between a grassroots activist or a culturally specific or a geographically specific or an organizationally specific perspective on this. So before I launch into this, I also want to say there are many individuals and programs who have made a difference over these decades, and I apologize in advance for not mentioning all of them. But I want you to have an understanding of the evolution of prevention, at least since the 1970s, and there were things going on before that. But I want to give you an idea and a feel of the 70s. One of the issues when I and others started doing child sexual abuse prevention work was that people didn't understand there was a problem, so they really didn't understand there was a need to invest in preventing it. Furthermore, beyond the denial that child sexual abuse happened, at least with any frequency, there was also barriers to talking about sex or sexuality in any way, shape, or form, especially to children. And so there was an it syndrome of education, which went something like, well, you can talk about it as long as you don't say it. And we want you to know that there's nothing wrong with it, and there's nothing wrong with those parts of your body. And it's not okay for anyone to do it to you. But if you have any questions about it, or if it ever happens, we want you to know you can ask and you should tell. It was like there's eyes, nose, toes, and we don't talk about anything between. In fact, we weren't even allowed to say accurate language, which is a mixed message when it comes to breaking the silence, knowing that there's nothing wrong with us, knowing that we really can talk openly and honestly about these issues. Now, there's other key markers in history that feed into the early work in child sexual abuse prevention: civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, and the movements and changes to really look at social justice and rights all feed into this because there's an interconnection between oppression. In 1965, there was work around pornography and looking at the harms, but it was framed more in morality and, in fact, looking at obscenity laws. In 1971, there were early speak-outs on rapes. There were early treatment programs on incest, Hank Giorgetto and Parents United, the first rape crisis centers in 1972. And even though then we're talking about adult rape, there were many that talked about early experiences of child sexual abuse, but it wasn't talked about as much as rape then. 1972 was the first Prevent Child Abuse America. Interesting, too, that we talked about child maltreatment, which included sexual abuse, but that was the part least talked about in the early decades. 1976, I was actually a research assistant on a study mandated by the Minnesota legislation to look at the effectiveness of sex offender treatment program around the country. There weren't many programs to study then. I'd mentioned one of them, but there was also Family Renewal Center, which was a treatment, a family program that looked at the whole family for incest. That was also in Minnesota, that was started by Patrick Carnes, who became later known for his work around sexual addictions. There was also survivor-led work then, and I think that's important because many people think that the survivor leadership has only been happening more and more visibly now. But Barbara Myers was very visible as an incest survivor who started Christopher Street. And at that time, those of us that were involved and were just desperate to try to get different professionals to actually talk about this issue and bring it into their work, whether they were therapists, law enforcement, people addressing adult issues, to speak about children. There was also a split between the folks that were doing self-defense work. So some of the early rape prevention was focused on self-defense, and it was, is that appropriate for children? Should we teach them to fight back, was a debate then. Now, the context of the mid and late 70s, if you look at this image, it's just going back and thinking about what was going on in our culture. One of the early prevention programs, child sexual abuse prevention programs, was one that I had been brought in to develop. It was actually in our Hennepin County Attorney's Office, and it was, my job was also to prepare children for court. This was before victim witness, before forensics. It was just to help talk to children and get them through that and develop a sexual abuse prevention program. And then I wound up working with a theater. So it was an odd combination, and we developed a play called Touch and Other Plays and toured those around the country. In 1977, another program that lasted is still operating, the Child Assault Prevention Program, CAP, started. There was I think it's important to note some books and some other things just because, again, this wasn't talked about much. The Conspiracy of Silence by Sandra Butler, Take Back the Night Marches, and some of the early funding for sexual abuse or sexual violence prevention programs, sexual advocacy programs, rape crisis centers, they were called different things, started in 1975. There's the National Center to Work Against Sexual Assault, the Sexual Assault Coalition in 1978, and early research on looking at child sexual abuse and how we understand it and how we frame it by Dr. David Finkelhor in 1978, as I said, and another key program started in 79, Committee for Children. So it's important to get a kind of a sense of that snapshot. There were programs, there were beyond programs, there were efforts and initiatives to understand sexual abuse, to make it more visible and invest in not only responding after, but what we could do to prevent it initially. We had to get people to recognize there was a problem that was much bigger than people wanted to admit. Still, the focus was on education, and it was individual education, what you need to do to not be victimized, or what I need to do to help you not be victimized. There was a lot of concern about scaring children, although we weren't having the same concerns about talking to them about dangerous strangers who were going to get them where we didn't even know what they were going to get. We talked about that, but to talk about people that they know and trusted who might betray that trust scared a lot of people about how do we do that in a balanced way? How do we do that in a developmentally appropriate way? It was pretty easy to keep up with the research in the journals because there wasn't very much on that, and there was already pushback to talking about this because of the confusion between what did it mean to promote sexual health and what did it mean to prevent sexual harm, and to talk about that frankly. I put this technology image up for the 80s because we just simply didn't have technology in the ways we do now to do education and to make change. We did have some federal funding, actually, for prevention of child sexual abuse. And that came to the program I then was at, the program that had been in the county attorney's office that then moved to Illusion Theater. And we provided technical assistance and coordination to 5 other programs that included a couple that brought other leaders into the field. Carol Plummer had the Indiana program. She became a researcher and educator in this field. And Jerry Chrissy, who did work especially with very young children and looking at the harm to preschool children. There was also Red Flag, Green Flag that came out of North Dakota in the beginning, which was a coloring book. So it was the idea of getting tools, simpler tools into children's hands that were non-threatening. It was also the beginning of the Children's Trust Funds and a larger sense of, okay, what's prevention mean in terms of health services and health services block grants? It was a time that sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, was becoming a topic at various other conferences. They weren't child sexual abuse specific, but at least getting keynotes and workshops at these conferences. There was also major activism around pornography. It happened to be on my radar because it's in Minneapolis where I am based, and Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon actually positioned this in 1983 as a civil rights issue, a violation of rights, and tried to look at the harms and violence against women in pornography then as something that they could go after damages. This passed as an ordinance, but then got vetoed by the mayor at the time. But the attention to pornography in its role to sexual violence, there was very little attention to what is called in our laws child pornography, but importantly as images of child sexual abuse images. So in 1984, there was another shift, and that was some very big media attention to cases of children. The McMartin daycare case. In Minnesota, there was a couple. Jordan, Minnesota, multiple victims, multiple people who perpetrated. And the Children's Theater case. That got a lot of attention and later quite a bit of backlash. We did, in Minnesota, a statewide media effort called Project Abuse. Other states tried to do variations of that, but it was 2 weeks of media attention, 1 whole week on the problem of child sexual abuse, 1 whole week on prevention. And shows, our shows Touch and No Easy Answers in schools throughout the state, a 24-hour hotline, and those got so many calls that it was completely jammed. All the volunteers couldn't keep up. In fact, many people wore buttons that said, "I survived child abuse," because the reports skyrocketed. This is always the issue with prevention, because yes, there will be disclosures when you do education, but that is not the point of prevention. The point of prevention is to stop that initial perpetration and that initial harm. Absolutely, it's important to intervene with that harm as soon as we can, to stop the person from perpetrating again, to stop them from initially doing it, and to heal the harm and heal the trauma. But what we really wanted to do was change the conditions in which child sexual abuse was occurring and help people know what they could do to stop it. So there was also a TV show rather, Something About Amelia, a movie. That's maybe an eye roller now, but you need to know that was kind of shocking then. There was the Spider-Man comic book that came out of Prevent Child Abuse America. And that was significant, again, because of that partnership with Marvel, which sounds pretty exciting now. It was very different then. And was, again, to normalize this, to have this discussion that somebody like Spider-Man could have been sexually abused as a child, and to talk about that, and to make it easier, and especially in that case also to talk about boys being victims. So Committee for Children, by that time, a program I mentioned earlier, by 1984 had been in over 3,000 schools across the country. By 1984, Touch and Our Other Play, No Easy Answers, and the related professional training on how to talk to children, how to interview children, had been out to 450,000 people in 35 states. So there was a lot already going on, but really just a little bitty bit compared to what you can reach with technology now. Still, there was pushback. There was a group, VOCAL, which was Victims of Child Abuse Laws. As people began understanding the problem, seeing the harm, there was a pushback to protect the rights of those accused, much more over the rights of those who had been harmed, and a pushback to trying to say we were making this problem bigger than it was, and that educating children meant that they were making it up, which there was no evidence to support. There was research also that showed the effectiveness of prevention in different kinds of ways, and research that called the question to perhaps the limits of the approach of this kind of way of going after prevention with individual education. Now, another shift in our attention came with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the merge with the Adam Walsh Center, because the other attention in the media came to missing children. Now, there's a strong overlap with the sexual abuse of children, the vulnerability of runaways, but it drew the imagination to the stranger, when in reality most children are missing because of a runaway situation, a known situation, or a family abduction. So we tried to coordinate as professionals. There were a smattering of us that focused only on prevention in different ways and felt we needed an association. So that was ASAP, that started in 1986, the Association of the Sexual Abuse of Professionals, to come together to try to not feel so isolated, to share education about what was working and not, how we were dealing with the backlash. There were also really exciting actual investments in prevention, because that investment in prevention, the money to help us do the work, came and went. In fact, in some cases, as hard as it was to get money for research, to research the effectiveness of the program, when you're on the ground doing the work, it felt like there was more money for research and evaluation than there was to do the programs. So it was hard to show effectiveness when we were so underfunded. In 1986, and it lasted to 1994, there was the Maxine Waters Act in California that set up the Northern and Southern Institutes that allowed for extensive training and understanding of what was going on and what was working and getting the information out. There was also more attention to college cases. In 1986, COS did the sexual aggression of college males study, and that's relevant for a couple of reasons. One is, what do we consider a child? We don't consider children college students, but we know the brains are under development until the mid-20s. So, and this issue of vulnerability of young adults, and all bring up the relevance of college, but also this was key to say, what do we know about the development of attitudes and behaviors that support choosing to use your privilege or to use your power to violate another person? What's going into the development of that mindset of somebody who chooses to do that? Now, another attempt to bring together multidisciplinary professionals and to stop us from working in our silos of academia and grassroots, of law enforcement and social services, of prevention, of treatment, of intervention, was the Wingspread Conference of 1987. And that was an attempt to say, can we come together and really put out some guidelines around what is the best practice? What do we need for child sexual abuse prevention and treatment policies? So over the 80s, there was a growth in attention to the treatment of those who commit sex offenses. There was also constant attention to aspects that were very related, but tended to take funding or attention or priority away from child sexual abuse, such as sexual harassment, which is a little ironic, given we know that if we want to prevent perpetration and the development of that, getting in early to prevent the development of sexually coercive behaviors that might show up in bullying that uses sexual kind of tactics or sexual harassment is really relevant. But they were dealt with as very separate issues. Or frankly, if I'm victimized by sexual harassment, that is a violation that is connected. But again, we were siloed. There was also much more attention in the 80s, not just now, to sexual abuse happening in faith communities, in youth-serving organizations like Boy Scouts of America, in daycare settings. Still, we tended to split. Who's fighting for these very limited funds? Are we going to invest in family violence? Are we going to invest in HIV/AIDS, which was coming to the light in the mid-'80s? And are we going to invest in peace curriculums? Are we going to invest in teen pregnancy, violence against women? And when funds are limited, we wind up fighting with each other instead of working together to see the connections and working together over our outrage about what's happening and the harm that's happening to demand broader systemic change and funding. So throughout all of this, it wasn't new, but the voices kept coming up louder to the need for culturally specific programming and special needs programming, and the limited funds that were there tending to be more geared towards white middle class, and the research there. Who was the research being done on? And this was a theme and is a theme throughout the time. Where is the money going? Where's the resources programming? Who are the programs that we're developing really speaking to? Who are the services that we're developing really for? Now, in 1985, we saw the development of the first child advocacy centers in Huntsville. There are now, I believe, over 900. So when you just think of trends and evolution, that is huge, the difference between what existed then and what exists now. And for those of you who don't know what children's advocacy centers are, those are ideally a one-stop shop where a child had been sexually abused, instead of going through a series of different interviews and having to tell their story over and over and over again, went where there was a person trained in forensic interviewing, unlike those of us that did the work early and had to try to figure it out, and to do the interviews. And many of those early programs also had aspects of prevention, if not prevention programs attached to them, but their primary focus was to deal with disclosures and to help that investigation, and then to help find services. Now, at the time, we were still pretty stuck in individual education and what I needed to do to not be victimized kind of mindset. And that's important. I'm not wanting to minimize that, but everything we know is that if we really want fundamental change, we can't just educate individuals, but we also need to look at what's happening in families, what's happening in communities, what's happening in our broader society, or as the Center for Disease Control and Prevention would say, the socio-ecological model. And when we are only focused in individual education about what I need to do to not be victimized, the message is, even though we're saying it's not your fault and you have all these rights, we're never saying it's not okay for that other person to be doing it as loud and as clearly. So it sounds like I'm not doing what I need to be doing, as opposed to that this person shouldn't have been doing it in the first place, or I wouldn't need all of this training and education. And so, but that was still our focus. There was also the launch of really major programs in youth-serving organizations. Boy Scouts of America in 1985 launched education not only for the children, but also looking at better screening of the volunteers and staff, looking at how to train the adults to better deal with this. Big Brothers, Big Sisters of America launched their programs, and it brought to our attention the difference between what do you do in an organization to protect children when you're working one-on-one with them by design versus broader-based programs. There was a lot more attention to what's called nonprofit risk management. So it kind of looks at an organizational level of what do we do to minimize risk for victims, which is great, but along with that is sort of a mindset of what do we do to protect our own liability? What are we doing throughout that realm? But there was definitely a shift in the 80s to not only be doing individual education on what do I need to not be victimized, but organizational practices. And as much as I say we had an emphasis on educating children, I also really need to say there was no way we could get access to children in schools without training the adults, without educating the parents, without reaching out to them. It just couldn't happen. People were way too afraid. So many programs also always dealt with parent education and outreach and training professionals, also while educating children. But it was still professionals doing the work was the focus, and that's important for where we are now versus then, so keep that in mind. It was how do we train professionals to be helping children, and how do we help parents to educate. I think it's important to note that in 1985, there was a program called SHARP, which was Sexual Health and Responsibility Program, that was geared at youth who had perpetrated sexual abuse. And the idea being clear, which was more common when people were even thinking about this in the country, that not all youth who were sexually engaged in sexually abusive behaviors or sexually harmful behaviors were the same. Some who did that just needed education to know that it wasn't okay. Some needed education and more. They needed treatment. They needed, with whatever was going on into their behavior. Certainly they needed families involved and to look at what was going on. Some were more violent and already and needed more monitoring, and some really had done serious enough harm and were still having risks, although we weren't talking as much about risk factors then as to need other kinds of intervention in the criminal justice system. So there was already attention to that, not as broad as it is now, and there was still more pushback. One of those came from a study at UC Berkeley, the Gilbert study on preschool, which had, in my estimation, a lot of questions we could ask about its credibility, but it was amazing how much attention it got to say that, oh my gosh, we definitely should not be talking or trying to prevent this with preschoolers, and it doesn't work, and kind of making fun of all the prevention education. It is an example of how much weight a study like that says this doesn't work gets against the studies that were showing the importance of prevention, because again, people really didn't want it to change. They didn't want to acknowledge the problem. It just taps right into the denial and the fears. Now, in 1985, ATSA, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, began. This is very important, again, because we tended to be isolated in those of us that focused on victims and the harm to victims, those that treated those who did the harm, who had offended, those of us focused on prevention. Again, all these silos instead of looking at the interconnections. So what can we learn from the people that work with treating those who had done the harm, from those who do the research on them, and how should that be feeding prevention. In 1989, there was a very visible abduction of Jacob Wetterling. It was in Minnesota. It got a lot of national attention, later led to policy changes related to those who perpetrate. So before we go on, I just want to pause there and say a little bit more about the 85 and 90 kind of trends to where we got to. So we're starting to see the shifts into organizational practices. We're starting to see a little bit more attention to how do we prevent or deal with the development of perpetration. What's going on with that, and how could we do that better? We certainly were seeing more efforts to say we've got to be talking to each other. We have got to be coordinating between those of us. Instead, there was a lot of suspicion between those that did victim advocacy and those that treated offenders, those that did prevention activism in the community, and those that were researching it. We had exceptions to that, where we all came together and talked. And we certainly had opportunities where we were starting to see this in the broader media, but pushback happening regularly also as we were making our progress. So I want to talk a little bit, before we move on, about what really were the key elements of the focus of individual education, again, as it focused on what I needed to do to not be victimized. And certainly part of that was that you have a right to say no. It did get a little bit that no one has a right to force or trick you into touch. It certainly did talk about that very often this is people you know and trust. A lot of the programs used variations on one of the concepts we had started, which was the touch continuum. That touch is a wonderful and great thing, but you have a right to set limits to touch you don't like. Touch can also be used in a harmful way. And when you're confused, very often the way the manipulation or betrayal happens is it starts out with something that is okay and then changes to something that's not, and you're kind of stuck with, wait a minute, I liked it before, what's happening? I'm confused. And a person can prey on that confusing. And it was also a lot of concepts that the way this could happen was not just force. In fact, often it wasn't force, but because you trusted somebody, because you may have loved somebody, that trust and that betrayal can be misused. So it was a lot of emphasis on trust your feelings. When something doesn't feel okay, it changes, that you can speak up and speak out. You don't have to wait till you're sure. But the sense of, I can say no, I can set limits, that I actually, if I'm not sure about something, I can question it. And certainly, if something has happened, that I have a right to talk about it, were all part of the concepts that were core in the early stages. There was attention to safety. What do I need to do to be safe? That we know we do fire safety, we do tornado safety. Wherever you happen to live in the country, there's different kinds of safety. You look both ways before you cross the street. Bad things that can happen, people can do bad things, and you need to know what you can do to minimize your risk or to help yourself be safer, more in the language of children. That we also found early on that the concepts of bullying were very connected, because they may not understand why someone would offend, but we could say, well, what's going on with somebody who would bully? And children would say, well, you know, maybe they were bullied themselves. Maybe they were taught that this is the only way. Maybe they think they have a right to do that. Maybe they don't realize what they're doing to somebody else or how they're hurting them. Or maybe they do. Maybe they just want to make you feel crappy because that makes them feel good. And that was a way to help them understand some of the issues around people who offend. And what does it feel like when you get bullied? Oh, you feel sad. You feel like it's your fault. You feel ashamed. You don't feel like you can reach out for help. You don't really want people to talk about it because you don't want to admit that you were victimized. That feels weak, that feels bad. You're afraid that it's going to keep happening again. And those really helped give sensitivity into what it feels like when somebody is victimized from somebody who perpetrates sexual abuse against them, who commits those acts against them. And really, it's all the programs talked about, it's okay to tell. You have a right to tell. You can report. And yet we knew that that's really hard to do, that there are many reasons why children don't tell that paralleled some of the things I was just talking about, and that in many ways, it's more amazing when they do, because they might be protecting the person who hurt them. They might love that person. They might hate what they're doing to them, but they love that person. There's also can be times where you might like the attention and like the affection and not really even understands what it is because nobody talked about what sexual abuse really is and why it's not okay for an adult to do that with a child, much less the attention we now have to peer-to-peer sexual abuse and understanding what you can do when that is somebody your age and somebody that you know or slightly older or perhaps even younger who is doing that to you. So this idea that that person does not have a right to be doing it, I have a right to be speaking up, I have a right to set limits, I have a right to question behavior. And when I'm not sure, I can ask questions. And then we talk about when you do tell, what are the reasons why somebody might not listen to you or might not believe you? And it's kind of sad that we have to do that, but the reality is oftentimes people don't listen because they may not understand what you're saying, because sometimes we're not saying it clearly. We're kind of hinting at it and hope they pick up on it. Or we feel like it's so clear, because it's so clear in our hearts and in our bodies, that we think everybody else can see it, but they don't. Or they may just not believe it. They may not want to believe it. So they want to say, oh, you just took it wrong, honey. That person would never do this. And to have the strength to say, yes, they did, and no, I didn't take it wrong, is in many ways too much to expect. We can still educate, but it is what's led to the platform of change and prevention initiatives that we're going to get to next, to talk about why it's critical that we don't think of prevention as something that is primarily on the backs of those targeted for harm.